Dinitia, I'm sorry.
I think we're on the air.
We're giving it a sec or two here. All right, Randy, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Randy, and I'm with the events team here at the University Bookstore in Seattle. Tonight, we have Dinitia Smith, an award-winning author who was awarded fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts and the Ingram Merrill Foundation. She has also won an Emmy for her filmmaking. We're also honored to have Brooke Allen, a critically acclaimed author and a contributing author to the Wall Street Journal, the New Criterion, the New York Times, and the Hudson Review. We encourage you to ask any questions you would like. They'll be at the bottom of the screen on the Q&A section. Tonight's show is going to be recorded for future viewings on our YouTube channel. And any books that we talk about will be featured in the chat section. Tonight, Dinitia will be introducing her new book, The Prince. It is described as an elegant and compelling novel which vividly brings the world of Henry James into the present day. Dinitia and Brooke, thank you for being here. Go ahead, please.
Okay, hi, Dinitia.
Hello, Brooke.
Nice to see you.
You?
And I thought it might be interesting for readers at this bookshop, because you've had a sort of long and varied career. You haven't spent your whole life as a novelist, although you've written several novels. And I happen to know that you started out as a filmmaker. And I would love to hear a little bit about your trajectory, why you went to film school, what kind of work you did, and how that segued into other kinds of writing.
Well, I went to film school for probably strange reasons. In college, I had been an undergraduate Joyce scholar. I had read Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses quite closely, and I didn't know where the novel was going to go. I was very young, and I was perhaps naive, and film seemed to be the artistic medium of the century and of our time, and it probably is. Then I found film to be exciting, but collaborative. And at that point in my life, it was really, it came out of the West Coast, not the East Coast where I lived. I had children. I couldn't really move there. My husband had a job. And at that point, there weren't many women you could look to who had succeeded in film or had children. And so that it seemed I really couldn't travel to. And so I started to write, which was all I knew how to do. And I wanted to write novels. I wanted to tell a story. I've always wanted to tell a story. And everything I've done in my career has been about telling a story.
Yeah, I mean, you had quite a career as a filmmaker. You won lots of prizes. Your films were very highly thought of, shown in museums. So it's kind of, yeah, I mean, it's a bold move then to move into fiction writing, which is very different, and journalism. Now, yeah. I first became familiar with your work way before I knew you, when you were writing for New York Magazine. And you did a lot of, you specialized in interviewing people, often rather difficult subjects, and making that cohere. And I thought that you told a story when you did that too. And do you want to say a little bit about that, the technique of interviewing, and how this relates to journalism and to fiction writing?
Well, say a profile where you do a lot of interviewing. You are, from those bits, you are creating a story of a life. I'm thinking of some of the pieces I did for New York and later for the Times. I wrote about the poet John Ashbery, piece I'm particularly proud of because it had to be accessible to the average reader or the intelligent reader. And I was interested in his background. For example, he was a lonely little boy in upstate New York. His father was a fruit farmer. He had very close to his grandparents. His grandfather was a professor. He made that leap and he became a journalist, actually. He was an art critic for Newsweek. So I was interested in the trajectory of his life in creating a little biography of maybe 6,000-7,000 words. And so that was very interesting. You have bits of material and you try to weave them into a coherent narrative, and it's challenging intellectually. Later at the Times, when I was at the New York Times, it was much the same thing. A lot of bits of information, how to make them coherent, how to make them into a story. And I think that's one of the things I loved about it. It was intellectually very challenging, but it was something I knew how to do. And I did it when I began to write fiction. That was what it was about, telling a story, a fundamental pleasure for children to be told a story. And again, I think we tell stories every day of our life, such as, you never guess who I saw. This person I thought was dead and she was alive, and we talked and she was very successful. In other words, the stories, every day in our conversation, we tell a story. And I particularly like doing that.
Well, it makes sense. And you take, I mean, again, you take somebody like John Ashbery and you have 6,000 words and he's led a long life. So how do you frame that story and how do you mold that story? I think it has everything to do with the kind of characters you're creating in your novels, and particularly the last one. You have written several novels, but it really has not been your full career. You have been a working journalist for many years and retired now from the Times, but you were at the Times for how long? How many years?
I was there for 11 years.
11 years. And at New York Magazine, that was a long time too.
10 years.
10 years doing this kind of thing. And during those years, and maybe starting before, how many novels have you written?
Well, I wrote one in my 20s that was published when I was actually 34. It took a great deal of effort. It was very, very hard. It was my first novel.
Why was it hard? What was it about? Tell us a little bit about,
I was interested. I came of age in the 70s when there was a lot of political activity. I was at NYU Film School. We were marching. Some of us were going down south to participate in the civil rights movement. And I was very interested in the people who did that, their motives. To some extent, when I was a journalist, I was an outsider from these events. And so the first novel was about these people, especially those who went to Detroit thinking it was Petrograd and wanted to organize. These were middle-class kids, sometimes well-off kids. And I was writing about people that I knew, and also writing about being an outsider to some extent when I became a journalist and I watched it. I wrote about the Columbia student revolt in 1968. I wrote about the race riots as a reporter that occurred, for example, when Bobby Kennedy died. And those things were, but always I was writing. The second novel came around, I was writing it during the 1980s. Very hard to write a second novel. All the time I was writing journalism to earn money.
Everybody says that the second novel is really hard. And I've not been a novelist, I don't really understand that, but maybe you can explain a little bit about that.
Instead, it's an odd thing. You've written a novel, it's sort of succeeded, it's been published, and now you have to do it again. And suddenly there's a sort of existential crisis. Well, am I really a novelist? Do I really know how to do this? Can I make this novel as good as the first? That's sort of one of the frightening parts of writing the second novel. I've never found it easy. I've never been able to sit down and say, I'll write a novel. But the second novel, you feel the first novel was good, it worked, and now you have to live up to that.
Right.
And I think that's what makes the second novel so hard. The third novel, I wrote before I went to the New York Times. And when I arrived at the New York Times, I finished it. When I was hired, I asked for 6 weeks to finish it off. And I did. And it was published while I was there. The next novel I wrote after I left the New York Times, because I left actually to write. My children were through college. I wanted to write full time. And the two last novels have been written during the period after I left the New York Times, which is significant because the New York Times, as I'm very glad I worked there, but it was very demanding, very pressured.
Yeah.
And it was very difficult for me to write while I was there. It was, you were working, I didn't even have that hard a job in New York Times standards, but you'd be working weekends and nights, and it wasn't conducive to writing a novel.
Right. No, I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's not. Yeah. I wanted to go into this novel. You might want to hold the book up again just so people can see it. It's a beautiful cover.
Yes.
And it has a special significance, the photograph, which I won't go into, but Dinitia might want to talk about. But the novel, it's the Prince. It's a famous title. It's not Machiavelli, it's Dinitia Smith. It's based on one of Henry James. I think it is his last novel, isn't it?
Yes. Well,
The
it's
Golden Girl?
his
Last-
last complete novel.
Right.
There were novels afterwards that had his name. One was a collaboration. One was an adaptation of a very unsuccessful play that, sorry for this sound. Does anybody hear a sound here?
I hear a sound. Is that
Yeah,
your phone? I'd like to turn mine off too.
I'm just going to turn my sound off for a minute.
Okay. We can't hear you now.
I still hear this sound. You hear it from your computer.
I hear it. It's okay now.
I still hear it, but if you don't hear it, that's all right.
It's not so bad. Maybe somebody, if it's really bad, Randy will cut in and say something.
Okay, well, Randy or Ed, if you're there, we might rev up again if it's bothering people. It's all right with me if it's all right with you.
Not so bad, Dinitia. We'll carry on and
Okay.
yeah.
The question was this Henry J? It's usually considered his last complete novel. It's kind of the apogee, the height of his style.
Yes.
The declaration on his part of everything he's about. It's a very difficult novel. It's almost, if some people consider it impenetrable. I love the novel because, for the reason I tried to write a contemporary version of it in The Prince, it's a novel about a rich family with a very dangerous secret. And my view is that all families have secrets, and what happens when those secrets come to the surface. So that's Henry James. And again, it's a difficult novel. As H.G. Wells said, Henry James is like a hippopotamus trying to push a pea into the corner of his cage and retain his dignity. Whatever that means, I love the quote. So I was fascinated by what he was doing in the novel and by the notion of secrets. So I took this as my, I used the structure I stole from him. Fortunately, he's not in copyright. And I just wanted to know what would happen if this took place in the 21st century. What would happen? So I brought it into the 21st century. I made, I created a very wealthy patriarch. I was interested in the results of the robber baron fortunes that occurred at the turn of the 20th century. The people who inherited that wealth, how do they feel about it? The robber barons were were rather brutal people, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and they were not well educated. And these people have inherited this enormous amount of money. And how do they cope with it? With the Rockefeller family, you see some of them have become doctors, environmentalists, and I was curious to try and understand how they felt about this past. So my patriarch, has immense wealth, and he understands to some extent his past, his history.
But he's the second generation. He's not the guy who made the money. He's
No,
husbanding.
exactly.
Yes.
He's actually probably the third.
Third generation, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then his daughter, who is very sweet, Emily, she has been sheltered by this wealth. And she has, in a way, not known evil. And part of the novel is about her knowing evil. There's a kind of primeval quality to certain aspects of the novel. There's this girl, Emily, there's her father, Henry, who, in an effort to sort of atone for his antecedents, has become a public interest lawyer. Emily is an innocent, sweet young woman. She marries a prince, an impoverished Italian prince. And people ask me, how could that be? And how could somebody be an impoverished prince? As I've said, I actually found such a person in Los Angeles operating a food cart that sells pizza. So the question is, why is he impoverished? Well, what happened is many of the Italian royalty, first of all, the Italian government doesn't recognize titles. So many of these royalty, some of them have these palazzos, grand estates, but they're taxed very heavily and they have a kind of landmark status. So people cannot turn them into apartments. They can't tear them down. They can't turn them into clubs or old age homes. And so they give tours to make money. They rent out rooms. So this guy, my prince, he is very worried about money. He has a mother who's growing old, and he's a bit lost. He doesn't quite know what he's doing with his life. He gets a job in New York with an Italian bank where he's sort of a decoration so that the bankers can introduce him as Prince Pavolacino, although he knows nothing about finance. They introduce him so that they can get people to invest in Italian stocks and bonds.
And he's quite a charming guy as well.
He's charming, he's handsome, he's a nice man. He also tries to do good in his life. If anything, he becomes a soccer coach, a volunteers for migrant children in Rome who are in terrible condition. So he comes to New York and he marries this sweet young woman. By the way, this was something that happened to the robber barons, to the second generation. Their daughters married into the European aristocracy, which was, impoverished or needed the money. And in return, the families gained the cachet of royalty. So,
there's a wonderful Edith Wharton book called The Buccaneers, which is on just that subject.
There you are.
Yes.
And now in modern life, this is being repeated.
Yes,
so,
always.
But they get married. And all of a sudden, his old girlfriend shows up. And the prince they had a passionate affair, but they couldn't get married because neither one had money. This girl is very charismatic, very beautiful, and happens to also be a childhood friend of his wife. So they can't help it. They resume their affair. It's a very passionate affair. The prince is incredibly guilty that he's doing this. And the novel, the trajectory of the novel is the growing awareness of the young woman, Emily, that something is wrong. And she doesn't want to see it at first. She doesn't want to articulate it to herself, but it grows and it becomes a terrible thing for her. And interestingly enough, she somehow persuades her father, or encourages is a better word, her father to marry this girlfriend, to get the girlfriend out of the way. And the novel, it resolves, I don't want to say what the resolution is because I'd like people to read it and know the end, but the end has been described as monstrous, what they do. And it's not what you expect. They don't kill anyone, but there's a solution that is sort of terrifying in its way, in its quiet way. So that's The Prince, that's the novel. Part of the novel is set on this beautiful island in Long Island Sound, an island that is owned by the family. No one can go on this island, but it's also a primeval space. It's untouched. There's first growth trees and fauna and flowers and wonderful birds, and no one can go on this island except this family. So some of this novel takes place on this island, and the island itself is somewhat based on Gardiners Island in Long Island Sound, which for generations was owned by one family, and that family still controls it. I don't know whether it's a trust. I have been on that family, on that island a couple of times. So I thought about it. The families are not the same, I should say. So that was, but it seemed interesting that it would be this primeval space where this
The way you speak about the island makes it almost sound like a metaphor for Emily.
Yes.
You talk about untouched, primeval, protected. You've used all the same terms that you use when you talk about the character of Emily. And the great Jamesian theme, of course, is American innocence and European, I will say, experience, but one might call it cynicism or corruption.
Yes.
Is that a factor in your book? And do you think it's still a factor culturally in today's world?
I know that there are people, Americans, they're here and there married to American royalty and British royalty. Winston Churchill's.
Meghan Markle.
Markle.
Uh-huh.
Winston Churchill's mother was American, and Churchill came from a very good, distinguished family, and so it's operative in that way. I'm not sure. The trajectory of my novel is Emily growing up, experiencing evil, experiencing the reality of the world, no longer protected. I don't know. I know that there are, Italian royalty who are businessmen, who are professors. And so that's true. And again, the fortunes have dissipated with time.
I was just wondering whether you think that inherently Americans are more innocent than Europeans still after the depredations of the last 120 years.
I don't think so.
Question. You don't think so?
No, because we were involved in the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, of course, World War II, but all of Europe was involved. And at the moment, we're trying to stay out of the Ukraine. I don't think we're innocent like that. We have a very highly developed military apparatus, very powerful, very complex, and that's an expression of our essential nature, I think, as Americans. So I don't think we're innocent anymore. I think we are extremely well equipped. We make a huge number of mistakes, but I think it's no longer the case.
Well, everybody always makes mistakes. That's not, we're not unique in that. Tell us a little bit about, first of all, do you think some of your listeners will have read Henry James and some won't. Does it matter?
No, not at all. It doesn't matter. It's a point of pride with me. My language is, I would call it ordinary. In no way, you could say that it tells the same story, but you really don't have to have read Henry James at all. Mine is a plain old story. Henry James told the story from the point of view of the consciousness of the characters. Very little action takes place, but it mirrors our consciousness. It's fits and starts, it's meandering, and his style is, I think, designed to keep the secret. It's a
Why?
veil.
Yeah.
Whereas-
Explain that. Yes, it's very interesting. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's, the style is almost deliberate. And I think I've discussed with you in the past, I have a theory, which is not certain, but the theory I have is he was at that point in his life in 1904 when it was published, possibly coming into his own as a gay man, either accepting his feelings for other men. I don't know that he ever acted on them, but I think, like Proust, he used the novel to express his longing and his desire. And he gave the prince, for example, he was friendly with a Count Primolo, who at the time he wrote, who was a bachelor like many of his friends, and who James spent a lot of time with. He was also, it would seem, in love with a sculptor who lived in Rome, an American, and at least judging from the passionate letters that they exchanged. So my thought, and I don't want to weigh on this, I don't want to push it too much, but is the secrecy you find in James, I think might be his hesitation. But that point in his life, we know that early in his life, he had some injury that, he couldn't fight in the Civil War. But I always wondered if that injury was a crisis, a sort of sexual crisis. And then as he grew older, his friends, his circle was primarily gay men, and some older women. Edith Wharton, he became close to, but it's possible that a lot of James is about secrets, and it's possible that he was expressing his feelings, his longings, and covering it with this veil of language.
Yeah.
And my language is nowhere like that.
I wanted to ask you that. I mean, I think you make a very good point that James's language, which develops over the course of his career, so that he starts out his early work is quite straightforward, and
Yes.
language becomes more convoluted and complex as he ages. And I think you make a good point that this somehow reflects changes in his life and his own character. And I wonder if you could say that describe your own style and tell me how it might reflect who you are.
Well, I think I learned a lot from being a journalist. I learned I don't want to say simple, but I learned to respect clarity in language. And I will say that I love James's language. And in fact, whenever I'm writing and I read James, his language infects my own. In this
Yes.
case,
Yeah.
it didn't really, because I was deliberately trying to extract from James's novel what he was doing, not so much to imitate him, not so much to give you an easy version of his work, but I have enormous respect for the clear sentence. And I think the years of being a journalist gave me that. And I always try for that. I write about the consciousness of my characters, but not, his style mimics the consciousness of his characters. It's unclear,
Yes.
it's got stops and starts.
And that was something quite new when he was writing. As you said, his characters don't speak his characters don't speak in full sentences or even paragraphs at the way many of his contemporaries did.
Absolutely, and we've discussed this, you and I. He is called a precursor of modernism. The novel evolved, as I've said to you. Dickens, his characters, he sets a scene. It's vividly described. You know his characters mostly by what they say and sometimes by what they wear. I happen to love Dickens. With James, you go inside character. He begins to, as I said, write from within their consciousness. There's very little description, hardly any description of setting or clothing. A lot of the novels take place on estates. In this case, in The Golden Bowl, it's an estate or several estates. My novel, but then of course what happens with James is, oddly enough, his brother William hated The Golden Bowl for the very reasons that some people can't read it because of its complexity. Virginia Woolf hated it. Now, Virginia Woolf was a modernist, I think you could call her that. So she was writing often from within her characters, minds and consciousness, but I think he influenced many, many writers. Either they took his writing, they were unconsciously mimicking it, or they were deliberately aware of it. You could say Conrad was influenced, even Ezra Pound, who was writing about within the minds of people he was writing about. I don't want to call them characters, but a lot of the poems are from within. And I think his influence was important, even though, as I said, some people detested it. And H.G. Wells, I did compare him to a hippopotamus. So,
And but you see things filmically too, and the way you describe Henry James's prose, you, I would say, write a little more filmically. Maybe that's your background, but there've been a couple of adaptations of Henry James that have been surprisingly good. The Innocents, which is based on Turn of the Screw.
Yes. Which novel? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
The Innocents, which is based on Turn of the Screw, well worth seeing. And this recent production, I think I told you about, What Maisie Knew. But it's very difficult to take these interior stories and make them be seen from outside. And the whole idea of adaptation, I was wondering whether you saw, and I didn't look this up before our talk because I didn't think of it until 5 minutes ago. But for instance, what's that Woody Allen movie he made a few years ago, which is clearly based on Streetcar Named Desire, but he never acknowledges it the way you do so graciously in your book.
Well, I asked Henry James to forgive me.
Right.
I think he would hate this book probably because it's so different from what he was after. Henry James was a failed playwright.
Yes.
And this may be why, because his instinct was to write from within a character. There's almost no action in these books at the end. For example, when in my book, The Prince, and in his book, when the prince and the charismatic heroine resume their affair, Henry James only allows them to have a kiss. I don't have a big sex scene in my novel, but I can go a little further expressing their desire. So as for adaptations, there have been some. I'm talking actually about film. I don't recall which Woody Allen movie.
Yeah, it's called Blue Lotus or something like that. I can't remember. I think Cate Blanchett is in it. And it's clearly A Streetcar Named Desire. And going into all this kind of stuff, I wanted to ask you, I would say that you have a particular take on romantic love, which is quite different from Henry James. And
in what way?
Well, what do you think?
Pardon me?
What do you think? I find your writing very romantic, very, very unashamedly romantic and straightforward in a way, in that manner.
I hope it's straightforward.
In all of your books.
Yeah, I think it is certainly straightforward. I don't know if I have a different view of romantic love. In The Prince, my novel, one of the things I borrowed from James is this refusal to, or inability or reluctance to see the truth. And actually, John Bailey, a British writer,
Uh-oh.
essay on James said, love in Henry James is not knowing. I can't give you the exact words, but refusing to know, meaning that you won't see the faults of the person you love. I think that's what he means. So I think I have that view. I think it's universal. It's something, part of love, in a way. We have to ignore or not see or not dwell on the flaws of the people we love.
Yes, and in your novel, I mean, I think you use the word evil and Emily becomes aware of evil, but those people are not evil. The prince, the husband, and the woman, the other woman, they're not evil. They're young people trapped in their own problems too. I mean, it's very humane in that manner. There's never a sense that in your book where you feel someone is evil.
Well, that's a deliberate effort on my part.
Yeah.
I people are a mix of good and evil. I really believe that. And this creates a rounded character, which of course Shakespeare did brilliantly. I tried for that, it wasn't a struggle, it was a natural instinct as a writer to not make, for example, the young woman who
Right.
intrudes on this marriage. I had to build a background for her to explain who she was. Her mother, who's half Italian, is kind of a feckless hippie, and this girl is neglected. But yet again, I made the mother love her daughter, although she couldn't really take care of her. So I was aware of that. It actually came sort of naturally to me. And the prince, I saw him as struggling for an identity.
Yes.
Yeah, and I wanted to understand why he did what he did. And for example, the girl who intrudes on their happiness, she's strong, she's independent, and he is floundering, and she gives him kind of an identity, a solidity. She accepts his weaknesses and still loves him. And so I was conscious of that effort. It wasn't a struggle. It's, I think, the way I write, it's just a natural thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very appealing to me. It's very humane. I like the fact that girl was somebody. Well, we can all see ourselves in a similar position. I don't think it's far-fetched. It was beautiful. It was really nice. I wanted you to talk a little bit about your last novel, which is equally interesting, and tell everybody a little bit about that, The Honeymoon.
Well, The Honeymoon is yet another look at the 19th century, because James, it was published in 1904, but the characters are living at the turn of the century. Okay, George Eliot was my literary heroine, like many female writers, and she, at the end of her life, after her beloved companion George Henry Lewis died, she married a man 20 years younger who was very, very handsome and very rich. Now, George Eliot at that point was very rich. He was the Stephen King of her era. Although
no, that's a little crude.
A little crude, it is.
Yeah.
But in terms of her wealth and fame, certainly not like Stephen King as a writer. So we know that they go on this honeymoon to Venice. And by the way, I should add that he begged her to marry him. She was very homely.
And he was how many years younger? 20, 30 years younger?
20.
She was 60 years old and he was
40.
40.
Yeah. And so they went on this honeymoon to Venice, and he jumped off the roof, the balcony of the hotel. And he tried to commit suicide, and the gondoliers rescued him against his will. So this incident, takes up a couple of pages in the biographies, and very little is known about it. And in fact, they lied to their friends and to the public about it. It was only that Johnny was sick, Johnny's recovering. They returned to England, they went to her estate, and then they bought a house in London, they redecorated it, they moved in, and she had hardly been there a few weeks when she died. But the mystery of this marriage, I was very interested. What did they want from each other? Remember, this young man begged her to marry him. And because so little was known about this incident, I thought I will write a novel and explore it. And again, she never mentioned it in her diaries. In her letters, it was Johnny's getting better. But I decided I wouldn't violate the known truth, but I used her diaries, her letters, the observations of people around her to try and figure this out. And where I couldn't get information, I brought it to the book. I went inside her head, and it was a way of, she was a very interesting character. And she was fascinating. She was extremely intelligent, and her learning, she spoke many languages. Her intellectual abilities were just dazzling, but she was homely, and she was relegated in the beginning of her career to being a sort of editor of the Westminster Review, and not the head of it, but she did all the important work. She was, she had affairs with men, married men. She was usually in some way rejected. She couldn't have them until she met this marvelous man, George Henry Lewis. So I saw her as a brilliant woman in a man's world. And she managed to overcome these obstacles through sheer talent and through sheer brilliance. Her knowledge of philosophy was extraordinary. Her knowledge, again, of language, of history. So I saw her struggle as what I think of as the struggle of many women, and also the issue of how she looked. She was, as I said, very homely, and men didn't stay with her until George Henry Lewis, who really gave her confidence, supported her, and it allowed her to be, I believe she was a sensual woman, by the way.
Oh, if anybody believes that the Victorians are straight-laced, they do very well to read her biography. I mean, a full life, to put it mildly,
Yes.
and a very colorful one on every level.
Absolutely.
And a sort of irresistible person to write about, I think.
It was. And the Victorians, they were pretty sexy.
Very, yeah.
She moved to the Strand in London, where she lived with basically her boss, the editor, the owner of the Westminster Review. She lived with him. He lived with his wife and his mistress, who was the governess. And she had an affair with him. So this guy, John Chapman, was very busy with these women.
Oh yeah, all kinds of craziness going on in all these different households. Yes, right. And different households related to each other. It all, with weird sexual and intermarriages and this crazy stuff.
And open marriages.
Yes, exactly.
There were open marriages. One of her first affairs was with a man whose wife also had affairs. And then when she moved to the Strand, the street was lined with shops that sold pornography.
Yes.
And these people, it just wasn't the way we saw it.
No, certainly not. Certainly not. It's not the way they wrote, because the conventions of that period, as with Henry James, meant that you simply, if you were a French writer, you could write about sex, but not if you were English or American.
Absolutely, you could not.
That didn't go.
Published. And it was odd, because the people who had these open marriages, tended to be outliers, intellectually outliers. They were interested in intellectual things, in philosophy, especially in religion. It was a time of transformation. The German rationalists were looking at Christianity in an entirely different way. The Church of England, the Anglican Church, they were in rebellion against the rituals, the rules of that. And this group were outliers, but I think that probably what we would call ordinary Victorian families, they had a lot of that. It was secret.
Oh, it was all secret. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
A lot of children from, not of their fathers.
Right.
Absolutely. It's fascinating. But, when anything is that repressed, it has to keep existing. These things don't go away. So
That's
where do you
right.
see it and where do you find it? George Eliot's a wonderful, wonderful writer. And I thought it was, not only fun to read, but very brave to go into the head of one of the most brilliant women
man.
who's ever lived.
Well,
And
I learned
a
a
certain
lot.
amount of confidence. It's called The Honeymoon for those who are interested, and easy to find online as well. I wanted to ask, there's so many things to ask you. Who are your favorite contemporary novelists?
Well, I think mentioned this to you. I think one of the most extraordinary novels that have been written or published recently is called Shuggie Bain. It's about the deindustrialization, it's contemporary, of the north of England and Scotland. The disappearance of manufacturing created extraordinary poverty and deprivation for many people. The men were out of work, they became alcoholics. The women struggled to feed their children. And in the novel,
Well, very much like the Rust Belt here in this country.
exactly.
Yeah.
And there were no jobs, and the women were very interesting because they wanted to be good mothers. They were desperate to feed their children. In Shuggie Bain, they sleep with men to make a little money to keep the family. The men are, often abusive. They're not so much bad as just broken.
Right.
And
Right. Yeah.
Margaret Thatcher, in the miners' strike of, I think it was 1984, she put the final ending of this. And I also love the novels of Pat Barker, who is known for the Regeneration series,
Yeah.
but prior to that, she grew up in that kind of environment, and she wrote some wonderful novels and stories about those women and the men who struggled through the deindustrialization, and which is, to some extent still in effect, certainly
Oh yeah.
in parts of our country.
Yeah. Although,
So-
changing with the change in technology, everything is different.
Absolutely,
But like certainly the Rust Belt towns of our youth were very, very much.
very
like
much.
that. In parts of England, I was just in Bradford, that still looks like that.
Yeah, and we see it particularly in West Virginia. And by the way, in the novel The Prince, their fortune, the family fortune, was made in West Virginia by the original robber baron. His name, I gave him his name, Ephraim Consider as in considering something, Woodford. And they named a town after him. He had steel mills, mines. He built railroads to transport those goods. And they sold the properties to the Japanese, who closed them. And there's nothing left in this town. And my patriarch, Henry Woodford, there is a decrepit mansion overlooking the mills, and he wants to build a museum in this mansion. And like a lot of descendants, when you look at it, of these robber barons, Vanderbilts, Whitneys, they have, they took to collecting art, to building museums, and So he's going to do this. He is going to, the family did collect art. It was interesting to discover at the descendants, the daughters primarily of these robber barons, they went to Europe, they brought back these old masters where some people might bring back postcards. Of course, they were very cheap. So they started to collect art. But they go back to this town, and I have a scene where they go to this town and it's just empty. It's terrible. And we have seen such towns. And he's hoping this museum will bring tourists in, business, and regenerate it, if you could call it that.
Yeah. For those of you, most people listening will not know that Dinitia's husband is an eminent historian and biographer named David Nassau, and he's exceedingly productive. And he's now retired from his position as a professor at the Graduate Center in New York and devoting full time to his writing projects. And I was wondering if you wanted to tell people what it's like for the two of you to be doing this together at the same time in parallel places, in the same room often. What's it like? What's all that like?
And don't forget, add COVID to that.
Oh, and COVID, yes, exactly.
We were in this apartment in New York City together in different rooms. Well, it's okay. I will say that I find his work very, very interesting. He wrote a biography of Andrew Carnegie, and I borrowed elements of that for my novel. I force him to read everything I write, and I read his books. He usually won't let me read them until the very end, and he doesn't take advice lightly. When he sees something in one of my novels that needs fixing, I immediately go and do it, like sheep, He's very, very well read in fiction. When I met him many years ago, he was very well read in philosophy and in political things. And I like to think, and I do think, and I think he would agree, that I introduced him to Henry James, and he reads really a lot. He's a bit too prolific.
He's very prolific. I mean, but you said something interesting, which is that that he could work from 9 to 5, and you're only good for 3 hours, and I'm only good for 3 hours too. I don't know how somebody.
I didn't know that, because you're very prolific.
Not like that.
To hear that from you, Brooke.
No, it's hard work. And then people often want to know about a writer's process.
Yeah.
How do you do it? What do you do every day? What do you have a way of doing it, or is it always different?
Well, I generally write in the morning, and bringing up John Ashbery, he told me that he only writes an hour a day, and when he was alive.
But he's a poet. That's different.
Exactly. But still, it sort of, I thought, okay, I can do that. Most of my novels, I wish I could explain how they start. Sometimes they start with an image. The first novel, The Hard Rain, which was about these radicals, was a result of one day I was in Detroit, and I was in a cab from the airport. I got to talking to the cab driver, and he asked me where I was from. I said, New York. He said, oh, I drove the man all the way to New York. I said, why? And he said, because he didn't want to fly. I said, well, what kind of person was this? Who could afford this? And he said, well, he was very well dressed, but he didn't wear any socks. So I was also present. I was in Detroit in the 1968 riot. Detroit was on fire, and I got on the last plane before they closed the airport, and I looked down and I saw the city in flames, and that stuck with me. So those two things came to mind. Again, in college, I had known kids who had really gotten involved in politics. So I was interested. And then as I said, I felt sometimes like an outsider because I was a journalist. in the student riots of 1968 at Columbia. I was there, only I was there as a journalist. My husband was occupying one of the buildings at Columbia, but it was a strange dissonance being outside. Although, and I was sympathetic to a lot of the things they were protesting the war. And so that begun that way. So I wondered, who was this guy? And I see Randy there.
We're just about out of time here, but it was absolutely fascinating. The book is The Prince by Dinitia Smith. I want to thank you both, Brooke and Dinitia, so much for being here with us. And I want to thank everyone out there for watching. And you can find the book on our website, ubookstore.com. And again, thank you and have a great night. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you. It was a lot of
See you
fun.
later.
Great to talk to you. Thank you,
Thank
Randy.
you, Randy. It's a pleasure.